Welcome to episode 136 of Lucretius Today. This is a podcast dedicated to the poet Lucretius, who wrote On the Nature of Things, the only complete presentation of Epicurean philosophy left to us from the ancient world. I'm your host Cassius, and together with our panelists from the EpicureanFriends.com forum, we'll walk you through the ancient Epicurean texts and we'll discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. We encourage you to study Epicurus for yourself, and we suggest the best place to start is the book Epicurus and His Philosophy by Canadian professor Norman DeWitt. If you find the Epicurean worldview attractive, we invite you to join us in the study of Epicurus at EpicureanFriends.com, where you'll find a discussion thread for each of our podcast episodes and many other topics. Today we continue with our discussion of Epicurus' letter to Menoeceus, and this week we discuss the issues of life and death. Now let's join Joshua reading today's text.
Become accustomed to the belief that death is nothing to us, for all good and evil consists in sensation, but death is deprivation of sensation, and therefore a right understanding that death is nothing to us makes the mortality of life enjoyable, not because it adds to it an infinite span of time, but because it takes away the craving for immortality. For there is nothing terrible in life for the man who has truly comprehended that there is nothing terrible in not living, so that the man speaks but idly who says that he fears death, not because it will be painful when it comes, but because it is painful in anticipation. For that which gives no trouble when it comes is but an empty pain in anticipation. So death, the most terrifying of ills, is nothing to us, since so long as we exist, death is not with us. But when death comes, then we do not exist. It does not then concern either the living or the dead, since for the former it is not, and the latter are no more. But the many at one moment shun death as the greatest of evils. At another, yearn for it as a respite from the evils in life. But the wise man neither seeks to escape life, nor fears the cessation of life. For neither does life offend him, nor does the absence of life seem to be any evil. And just as with food, he does not seek simply the larger share and nothing else, but rather the most pleasant, so he seeks to enjoy not the longest period of time, but the most pleasant. And he who counsels the young man to live well, but the old man to make a good end, is foolish, not merely because of the desirability of life, but also because it is the same training which teaches to live well and to die well. Yet much worse still is the man who says it is good not to be born, but once born, make haste to pass the gates of death. For if he says this from conviction, why does he not pass away from life? For it is open to him to do so if he had firmly made up his mind to this. But if he speaks in jest, his words are idle among men who cannot receive them. We must then bear in mind that the future is neither ours, nor yet wholly not ours, so that we may not altogether expect it as sure to come, nor abandon hope of it as if it will certainly not come.
Joshua, thank you for reading that for us today. For the start of this episode, we've chosen to read basically the entire section from the letter to Menoeceus that deals with the issue of death and how long to live and issues that are closely related to that. But this is one of the most well-known and important issues in Epicurean philosophy, so it's likely that we're not going to finish it today. We wanted to give the full context so that everybody would know as they started thinking about this topic, everything that Epicurus said in the letter about the topic. Also, before we started recording today, Cassius brought up an issue that we could profitably address right here at the beginning. What was the contemporary opinion about whether there was a life after death and what it meant in terms of Hades or the underworld or anything like that? Cassius, is that basically the question, or would you restate it differently?
There is parallels, but yet differences in how we think about the afterlife. And on Wikipedia, I see kind of a brief explanation, which I can really quickly read. It says, in older Greek myths, the realm of Hades is the misty and gloomy abode of the dead, where all mortals go when they die. Very few mortals could leave Hades once they entered. The exceptions, Heracles and Theseus, are heroic. Even Odysseus in his Menoeceus calls up the spirits of the departed rather than descend to them. Later Greek philosophy introduced the idea that all mortals are judged after death and are either rewarded or cursed.
It's a very complex subject. I don't think we can think of Greek religion, theology, etc., as something that is uniform and monolithic in the sense that you can think of maybe Christianity as being far more monolithic, even though we know that Christianity has now fractured into a million subsects. Religion for the ancient people was widely diverse, and they sort of accepted not just the myths of their own country, but in some ways the myths of other countries as well. And so this must necessarily also reflect on the afterlife. And then Edward Gibbon has this famous quote. He says, the various modes of worship which prevailed in the Roman world were considered by the people as equally true, by the philosophers as equally false, and by the magistrates as equally useful. Now, that's a rather cynical. With that view in mind, and granted, Edward Gibbon is a rather controversial figure as well, let me just give you my outline of what I see being the prevailing view in Greece around the time of Epicurus of what happens when you die. You know, this is such a complicated thing because we don't think of it this way, but transmigration of the soul was actually a huge belief as well that had come over from Asia Minor. And then you've got the Egyptian beliefs. But in general, Hades, or the underworld, is not a place of punishment. That's true in a very few cases, and those cases are also very famous. You've got Ixion's wheel, where is he tied to the wheel and he's just turned over for all time, or is he pushing the wheel? I can't remember. You've got the case of Sisyphus, who's got to push this boulder up a hill, and then when it gets to the top, it rolls back down, and he's got to push it up again. You've got the case of Tantalus, who is in a stream of water with fruit hanging over his head, but every time he goes to reach for the fruit, the boughs of the tree pull away, and every time he goes to take a drink of the water recedes. So in a few select cases, you have punishments that are deemed fit for the crime. And then on the other end of the spectrum, in a few select cases, you've got this place called the Happy Isles, which is where all the heroes end up going after they die. So Achilles and Odysseus and Homer will be in the Happy Isles. But the common fate of most people is precisely the thing that most Greeks want to avoid, and that is simply to be forgotten. You don't go to the underworld to be punished. You go to the underworld as a sort of forgetting. And you just sort of wander around, as Lucretius says of Ennius's description, shades pale in wondrous wise. So it's not at all like what we think of when we think of hell. It's not like what we think of when we think of heaven. It's this weird alien place where, for most people, it's just an endless diminishing of consciousness.
Joshua, what you've just said is my understanding as well. I noticed in looking at Lucretius, there's line 102 from Book 1, where he says that, still I fear your caution will dispute the maxims I lay down, who all your life have trembled at the poet's frightful tales. Alas, I could even now invent such dreams as would pervert the steadiest rules of reason and make your fortunes tremble to the bottom. No wonder. But if men were once convinced that death was the sure end of all their pains, they might with reason then resist the force of all religion and contemn the threats of the poets. As it is now, we have no sense, no power to strive against prejudice, because we fear a scene of endless torment after death. And yet the nature of the soul we know not, whether formed with the body or at birth infused and then by death cut off, she perishes as bodies do, or whether she descends to the dark caves and dreadful lakes of hell. Or after death, inspired with heavenly instinct, she retires into the brutes, as our great Ennius sung. So it's a confusing picture as to whether they really thought there was endless torment after death or not. And I'm convinced that you're right, Joshua, that it was not universal that they thought that that would happen, but probably was universal a fear of what could happen to them after death. So that even if they weren't convinced that they will burn forever if they do bad things, even if they didn't have that kind of frame of reference, they still were not anxious to find out what was going to happen to them when they died. So with that as background, one of the most famous lines in Epicurean philosophy, become accustomed to the belief that death is nothing to us.
Let me add in one more thing, which is something that Lucretius said. You might have just talked about this, and I wasn't paying close enough attention, but he's talking to Menoeceus, and he says, one day or other, you yourself may fall away from us, seduced by the rant of priests or something like that. And so it's not merely that death is something that we naturally fear, it's that we're culturally conditioned to fear death. And there's people who trade in convincing you to be afraid of death and to accept their cure. Epicurus is offering a cure here, which he's giving to you freely, and you can accept it or not. And I think probably for a lot of people who come to Epicurus, it's not just so that we can party all the time and live in extravagant orgies of sin and dissipation. That's not why we're drawn to this philosophy. We're drawn to this philosophy, at least in part, because of what he has to say about life and what he has to say about death.
And if you follow the order from the principal doctrines, this is actually more important to us than even the issue of pleasure and pain, because it comes first. First off, he addresses the issue of gods, but even that is just closely related to this issue. I might even say that this issue is really more important than the issue of gods. You know, there's that, was it Pascal's wager or whatever, about the issue of if you think that there really is an eternity of bliss ahead of you by listening to the religious threats and bribes, then you would in fact listen to them, because it would be worth it if you could achieve eternal bliss in heaven by following the regulations of a religion. But if you once become convinced that there is no life after death, then, as we've discussed many times, and I think of all the different illustrations Joshua has brought up, which is the story, Joshua, about Thomas More said that the one thing you couldn't be in this utopia is not believing in life after death, right?
Yeah, to believe that the world is the mere sport of chance and that the soul dies with the body are the two things which it is forbidden to believe in More's utopia.
So you can take all the positions you want to about virtue and pleasure and pain, but that's not as important as just believing that you can be punished in heaven for an eternity if you fail to follow the rules.
Yeah, and if you don't believe that you're going to be punished for an eternity or rewarded after death, we as a society or as a civilization cannot trust you. I think it was John Locke who said that promises, covenants, and oaths can have no hold upon an atheist. So if you don't kowtow to this idea that you're going to be punished after you die for what you've done in this life, then you simply can't be trusted as a person.
I'll throw another example on there too, which comes to my mind because we talk about Cicero so often. I'm remembering that in one of his speeches, he accused Julius Caesar of being potentially an Epicurean because Caesar had made the argument, this is the Catiline conspiracy stuff out of Cicero, that Caesar had argued that Catilines should not be executed, or that his conspirators should not be executed. Caesar said it would be better to send them to some prison out in the cities of Italy, because once they're dead, they're not punished anymore. But if you keep them in prison for a long time, that's a worse punishment than just executing them. And as a result, Cicero accused Julius Caesar of having Epicurean tendencies for having made that argument, because Cicero wanted to execute them immediately.
Let me drive us in one more direction. The very first line of the Iliad by Homer, the first word is rage, and the first line is talking about the rage of Peleus' son Achilles, who sent many heroes down to Hades. So this is in the first line of the first major literary work of the Greek world. It's this issue of death. It's immediate. It's immediate in Greek literature, and it's there all the way till the end. And this is why I think Epicurus wants to deal with it and sees it as so important, because it's culturally one of the most important things that humans discuss and talk about.
Joshua, you're about to get me wound up on this issue because, I don't think we tend to put much emphasis on it in our readings of Epicurus and so forth. I have a feeling most of us, I guess because of our Christian background or whatever that we've been taught over the years, we just kind of take for granted that there is something after death, whether it's some kind of spiritualism or whatever, whether it's Christian or anything. It's almost a given, it seems like, in our culture that even the popular culture, nobody really takes the position that when you die, you're just gone. They're always holding open this possibility or even probability that there's some kind of consciousness or existence after death. And I think that's wrong for us to de-emphasize that, because these points that are being made here that we're discussing, you can't really be free to live your life the way you want to live it today and during your lifetime if you think you're going to be held into account to somebody else's standard after you die. Not only is it a matter of getting rid of pain in a very general sense, but you're a slave of whatever you think is going to happen to you after you die. You can never really put that out of your mind other than by sort of closing it off and trying to forget about it. But sweeping things under the rug is really never a very good idea, I think, to deal with important issues. You should affirmatively, if you can, take a position on it and follow the implications of that position. And this is a subject that's much more important than issues like whether the universe is infinite or whether the universe is eternal. I can see the possibility of putting some of those issues aside and not really worrying about them. But the idea of what's going to happen to you after you die, that you could somehow be hauled before some judge and held to account for it, is something that extremely practical in terms of how you live your lives today. It's well worth being at the beginning of the text, and I think I did finally find a copy of Principal Doctrine number 2 is simply, death is nothing to us, for that which is dissolved is without sensation, and that which lacks sensation is nothing to us. That's very close to what we're reading here in the letter to Menoeceus, almost identical, in fact.
So I think that this brings up the idea that consciousness depends on sensation. So this goes against what some people believe, that somehow consciousness can exist outside of the body.
I would say that it's not just some people who think that consciousness doesn't require a brain. It's most people, in my view, think that you can sustain consciousness and that there are conscious beings who don't have what we would conventionally call sensation. Of course, Epicurus himself rules out that idea by giving the gods physical form.
One more thing before we leave that very first sentence. Become accustomed to the belief that death is nothing to us. I've always been concerned that that's interpreted as being a flippant remark, almost like it's being dismissive and saying that you don't care about it all and you're not even going to think about it. But we're not only going to think about it, we're going to devote a lot of very important sentences to it in this discussion, and we're going to constantly talk about it in Epicurean philosophy. So it's not nothing to us in the sense of irrelevant to discuss. In fact, we can't really go too much further without talking about the issue of, are we talking about the way you die? Is that nothing to you? Or is it really, the phrase I generally use, the state of being dead that's nothing to us? What is it that's nothing to us, Joshua? And what does it mean to say that it's nothing to you? Does that mean it's irrelevant to you?
Well, I would take a very literal and physical approach to what Epicurus says elsewhere. He says that when we are, in other words, when we continue to exist as a conscious being in the universe, then death to us does not exist, right? We're not dead, we're still alive. And that when death is, in other words, when the moment comes when you die and cease to exist as a conscious being in the universe, when death is, we are not. And so it's this idea that there's a clear boundary between life and death does not have any real effect on our life, except, as he says here, in anticipation. It's the anticipation of death, the fear of death before it happens, to Epicurus's mind, causes all the problem with the experience of death, because you don't experience anything when you're dead. It's just the fear of what you'll experience when you die that causes so much grief for so many years for so many people's lives.
What if somebody says to you, Epicurus said that death is nothing to us. Why are we even bothering to talk about this? It's nothing to us. It's irrelevant. Let's move on and talk about something else. What if somebody says that to you, Joshua? What do you think is the right response to that?
Well, I would focus in on that word accustomed, as both Bailey and Hicks use the word accustomed. This is not something that Epicurus meant for you to just flippantly discard this whole set of beliefs and practices and religious principles that were surrounding him and surrounding us. It's not just throwing this stuff off and then just going to do whatever you want. You need to spend time, not just today or tomorrow, but throughout your life. You need to spend time thinking about death and what happens when you die. That to me is the meaning of the word accustomed there. He clearly, by that word accustomed, takes this to be something very serious and something that is worth consideration over the long term.
And I think it's Seneca who said something to the effect that Epicurus said to actually think about death. There's that meditate mortem line, I think, that's in Seneca that he attributes to Epicurus to tell us to meditate on these issues.
At the very end of the letter to Menoeceus, at the very end of this letter that we're reading, he says, meditate on these and other things, both alone and in company with like-minded people, etc. So everything we're reading in here is something we're supposed to not just read once and then throw onto the bookshelf, never to be read again. Everything that we're reading here in this letter is something that we're meant to read over the course of a whole human life.
Martin, any particular part of this you'd like to tackle?
Yes, I'd like to comment on this, that most people think that there is conscious without a body and conscious without sensation. But this is different from what I see as Christian-inspired popular beliefs in Germany. So I think what I most common see when people who believe in the afterlife, that they, when once their soul has separated from the body, they see what the beloved ones do here on earth. No? So that means there is still some sensation, even though they are no more with the body. They have a different way of sensing what's going on and literally in some way see it. No? Otherwise, this whole idea wouldn't make sense. And I see this very often, that people refer to this in this way, including my own father, who wasn't even religious at all, but I don't know whether he jokingly came up or not, but this is something very common in popular belief. Plus, even weirder, we have a saying in Germany, if somebody does or says something which is fundamentally against something what was important to the deceased one, then the body of that person rotates in the grave.
I almost didn't follow you in the very beginning, so I think I'm going to ask you to explain exactly what you mean. But now everybody's heard of the cliche about people rolling in their graves when things happen in the world above them that they would not have liked. But so, Martin, explain again, what is this attitude you're talking about that your father had?
This popular belief is that the soul which is in heaven can see what the beloved ones do on earth who are still alive.
Yeah, you're saying that people who are not even Christian think that in Europe?
I mean, I wouldn't say my father was not Christian, but he at least wasn't religious, in the sense that he detested the church, but he never stated any atheist preference. And also in the end, he thought there would be no afterlife. But before that, at many occasions, he in some sense referred to this, that those who are dead and in heaven, that they can see what we are doing. But plus, I know this only from a couple of movies. So there we have this idea that those who have died can become something like protective angels for their beloved ones.
Guardian angels, yes.
So, but of course, what I say is completely non-Epicurean. I don't believe anything of this. But I think it's just to say that I don't think that the majority thinks that consciousness without sensation is there. So they really think, they think merely that the soul can exist without the body, and it has other means to sense what's going on.
If people believe that they're going to continue to live after death, to some extent that removes the urgency to live your life while you're alive. In fact, I feel like there's a Vatican saying or something to the effect that if people once believed for sure that they were in fact mortal and they were not going to continue to live, they would be more intent on living their lives and not postponing their happiness. Maybe there's that one for sure. The one about don't postpone your happiness because we've drunk a mortal brew or something like that.
We have added evidence for this, what you just say, by those early who contracted AIDS, something like, say, 20 years ago, 20 to 30 years ago, because at that time, that seemed would mean they would die within a few years. So quite a number of them, they spent all the money, they made debt, spent it, and they got then the surprise when medical progress was sufficient that even though they could not be cured, but they could sustain their lives. No? So they had to face paying back their debt.
Well, we're doing a very good job of hitting home on the significance of the topic, and we're not moving very far through the specifics of it yet. Let's go back to what Calasini brought up a few minutes ago about the issue of all good and evil consists in sensation and death is deprivation of sensation. That's kind of his ultimate proof of the whole issue. And his whole argument will stand and fall, I think, on that very contention right there, that all good and evil consists in sensation, but death is the deprivation of sensation. So let's go into that. Do you guys agree that that is ultimately the foundation stone on which everything else here is based? I mean, he's not just making an assertion that there is no heaven and hell and just stopping at that point. He is attempting to give us some reasoning and some evidence that would support us reaching his conclusion. I think that's probably the real heart of it right there. So do we accept that it's a good argument that all good and evil consists in sensation, but death is deprivation of sensation?
Oh, yeah, I totally agree with that.
Yeah, and Lucretius actually takes it one step further. He outlines what is now referred to as the argument from symmetry, which is that you spend your whole life being afraid of death, but before you were born, you spent an entire eternity in a non-conscious state and apparently suffered nothing by that. So the cessation of sensation and consciousness that will come with death is going to be identical to everything that you, I guess, didn't experience before you were born. You know, it's an eternity on either end of your life. And so one of the eternities you've already been through. And so you've just got one more coming up, but you won't know it. You won't be alive to experience it.
It won't cause you any more harm than all those bad things that happened in the past and we didn't know about it and it caused us no harm. There'll be all sorts of things that happen in the future that we'll not know about and will cause us no harm either. We've included in the episode notes today the section from Lucretius that you're talking about, Joshua. It's mainly it looks like the end of book 3. The conclusion of book 3 is a very long discussion starting around line 830. That also begins with the section, death then is not to us, nor does it concern us a whit, inasmuch as the nature of the mind is but a mortal possession.
When I try to explain this to a non-Epicurean, then he may raise the objection. We simply don't have any memory of what happened in the eternity before we were born. Maybe we were suffering in eternity, we just don't remember it.
So what's a good response to that? I think there's a river of forgetfulness, right, Joshua? I'm forgetting whether you're supposed to drink it when you are born and when you die, but
that would be the lethe or lethe.
I mean, we can
Martin?
imagine it is similar to the deep sleep state, because in the deep sleep state, if people wake up from deep sleep suddenly, they cannot remember what happened, but they can be emotionally in extreme turmoil. So something is going on in the brain and it doesn't leave a memory, except that somehow if you get excited with fear or something like this, it takes a minute or more to get rid of that fear. Mm-hmm. So it's different from these nightmares. No? If you have nightmares, that is in light sleep, when you have this dream phase, so those you can at least briefly remember. And if you train yourself to memorize them, you can memorize them better. Or if it's repeating, you can increasingly memorize it. But from deep sleep, you don't have a memory of what was going on in your brain. But it can be as intense or even more intense than waking up from a nightmare.
Well, now, I think that this whole section here in the letter is presenting something that's a remedy toward fear and worry. And it's also presenting a whole worldview that we can basically choose to believe in. Just like other people, they don't realize how they're choosing their worldview. But ultimately, in some sense, this is all theoretical, because when we die, we don't know what exists. Nobody comes back from the dead to say, okay, this is what happens after death. So as human beings, we've all created stories to make sense of it. And it seems, especially for me, this makes sense for me because it does lead to a sense of peace and it leads to a removal of fear. And I feel it provides a worldview that is in alignment with science and the scientific process, which is very important to me.
Yes, and essentially we make a choice. No? And for me personally, the Epicurean philosophy is the best choice to do.
I think where you are now, Calasini, you've moved to what we have as the third sentence. Therefore, a right understanding that death is nothing to us makes the mortality of life enjoyable, not because it adds to it an infinite span of time, but because it takes away the craving for immortality. And that's beginning to hint at some things we've been discussing a lot lately on the forum around Principal Doctrine 19 and the doctrines that are in that section of the list. But the bottom line is that as a practical result of realizing that death is the end of consciousness, the end of sensation, frees us from so many different problems. Not necessarily frees us and just leaves us floating alone, but frees us to then use our minds and use our bodies and use the things that we have available to us to actively pursue the right kind of life. Again, it's so many of these different things. You can state them in sort of a passive way or an active way. Here he's talking about it doesn't necessarily extend your lifespan at all, although presumably if you're using your mind aggressively, you are going to have a longer lifespan than somebody who just sits around calling on witch doctors to help them. But it takes away the craving for immortality. And that would take us back into the direction of 19, which we'll get to later on, about how the mind can understand that an infinite time is really not necessary to live the kind of life that humans have possible to them. At any rate, this whole issue is that a right understanding of this issue of death is very, very important. The very first line in 125 is going to extend that, but I don't want to go there if somebody has another comment before we go there.
I just want to add in here, because I haven't put in my thought here, you certainly do have to take that sort of step of analysis and ultimately coming down on one side, because it's not possible to prove that there's nothing beyond the grave. It's not possible to prove that there is anything beyond the grave. Ultimately, an individual has to examine whatever evidence or claims they think they can examine and try to do the best they can. And I personally have satisfied myself that I think I have the best answer to that question, but that will be a stumbling block for many people. They're not going to really even get to the point where they can experience the palliative of not caring about death, because they can't make the necessary argumentative leap first. And so I don't know what more to say to those people, but it's certainly a problem. You have to get to a point, and Epicurus is trying to get you to a point where you can accept his claim that death is nothing to us. But if you never get that far, the letter to Menoeceus probably isn't going to be very helpful to you, unfortunately.
Yeah, I would continue to focus on that line about all good and evil consisting in sensation, because to me, so much of Epicurean philosophy comes back to whether you accept that contention or not. Once you do accept the contention that sensation, the faculties of hearing, seeing, and all those along with it, the feeling of pleasure, and of course this issue of anticipations, once you come to the conclusion that you have to be able to make contact with something or to feel it in the many senses of the word feeling, once you realize that if you don't feel something, it really isn't relevant to you. If you can't somehow come into contact with it now or in the future, then there's really not much difference between those things and just pure imagination and pure dreaming. If you really go down that road of practically speaking, what is relevant to you in your life, it's only those things that you can feel, that you can touch, that have some relationship to you. That's the point that everything else hangs on. If you really get rigorous about looking for a standard of proof that requires evidence, if you're willing to base your life on what evidence do you have of something, then I think this is a very good argument. All good and evil consists in sensation, which is just calculated to make a Stoic or a Platonist or a deist or any kind of theist go wild with anger, because feeling is something they consider to be an obstacle to wisdom or something to look down on. But in the Epicurean worldview, if you don't have evidence for it, then there's no reason to think that it exists.
So on that point, let me get something in here by Cicero. I can't remember which book this is from, but I'll try and find that and put it into the thread on the forum. He says, "If I err in my belief that the souls of men are immortal, I gladly err, nor do I wish this error, which gives me pleasure, to be wrested from me while I live." So he doesn't seem to accept Epicurus's terms. He finds pleasure not in coming to terms with death, but in holding to a view of immortality, even if he thinks he's going to be wrong. And certainly the way I read this belies to me an intrinsic feeling of pain that he already has, and that the pleasure he imagines he has by thinking of the immortal souls of men, whether he's wrong or not, this is a way of responding to that pain, or that's how I read it.
You could almost try to reconcile what you just read from Cicero with what's later on in the letter to Menoeceus about it would be better to believe in the myths about the gods than to believe in what is essentially hard determinism. You could almost see Epicurus taking the position that, well, yeah, if believing in this fantasy of living in heaven for the rest of your life is in fact pleasurable to you, then by all means indulge that pleasure. You could see the potential of that argument being made. But I don't think Epicurus would make that argument. And so you've got to figure out a way to, well, how do you reconcile all that together? And I think that you reconcile it through the physics and the epistemology of Epicurean philosophy. He's not just simply saying, if it feels good, do it in Epicurus. He's telling you to think about the implications of what you're doing. And ultimately, yes, you want what you do to feel good. But that's not the way the world is, that you can eat as much ice cream constantly as you want. The world functions in natural ways that are beyond your control. And you have to predict the results of your actions and choose and avoid accordingly. And ultimately, therefore, you've got to take a position on many facts of existence. Is there really a heaven? If there is a heaven, then by all means, I think Epicurus would say, go for it and follow all these rules if, in fact, that guarantees you eternal bliss. But is there evidence that that is, in fact, going to happen? I think Epicurus would say clearly no. And in fact, is there a lot of evidence that that's not going to happen? I think Epicurus would say clearly yes. But you end up having to take a position on factual matters that go beyond just blind faith. If you did not conclude that all good and evil consist in sensation and death is the deprivation of his sensation, then I don't think you could make a reasonable argument that you'd want to be an Epicurean. If you believe that there's an afterlife and that how you spend that afterlife is going to be determined by what you do here, then you're going to live entirely differently.
Yeah, definitely. I always forget who wrote this, but there's a book that suggests that it is only Christians who can really be Epicureans, because it's only Christians who are making choices that will allow them to experience real pleasure and real happiness. And of course, the pleasure and happiness being described is the pleasure and happiness of heaven. And that Epicurus himself, by making the choices he made, was actually choosing an eternity of pain. It's not a book I think highly of, but certainly the central proposition that if you reject Epicurus's claim of that the soul dies with the body and that there's no experience or sensation after death, you're not going to find anything really helpful in almost anything else he has to say.
All right. So I think I've read it briefly, but for there's nothing terrible in life for the man who has truly comprehended that there's nothing terrible in not living, so that the man speaks but idly who says that he fears death, not because it will be painful when it comes, but because it is painful in anticipation. For that which gives no trouble when it comes is but an empty pain in anticipation. And then he doubles down on the nothing to us. For death, the most terrifying of ills, is nothing to us, since so long as we exist, death is not with us, but when death comes, then we do not exist. It does not then concern either the living or the dead, since for the former it is not, and the latter are no more. So it looks like he's addressing there this argument that, okay, well, I'm an Epicurean. I don't believe that I'll be suffering when I'm dead, but I'm suffering now because I'm thinking about the fact that I'm going to be dead and it causes me pain now. So apparently some people were willing to go halfway maybe and say, well, I'm not worried about what happens after I die, but I don't like worrying about it now.
Yeah, I mean, it's really more of the same, isn't it? This is part of being accustomed to the belief that death is nothing. You have to go over it a number of different times in a number of different ways throughout your life for the idea really to sink in. And here's maybe an angle to approach this. Christopher Hitchens, in his autobiography that I've talked about before on the podcast, says that, even though he's an atheist, he does not believe in punishment or reward after death. He says that the problem with death, as he was approaching it, was that, and the problem with Lucretius and Epicurus and their response to death and the advice that they offer on that point, is that his feeling was not that the party was going to come to an end. His feeling was that the party was going to keep going on, the party of life, but that he had to leave early. Mm-hmm. And so there's this, not everybody fears death because they fear what comes on the other side of death. For some people, it's they just don't want to stop living. They want to go on living forever. And that's been a huge conversation on the forum lately, is this idea of immortality.
Yeah, Joshua, that probably takes us on into 126, and maybe we can begin to conclude today by introducing this issue. 126 says that the many at one moment shun death as the greatest of evils, yet yearn for it as a respite. But the wise man neither seeks to escape life nor fears the cessation of life, for neither does life offend him, nor does the absence of life seem to be any evil. And then there's the line that we talk about a lot. And just as with food, he does not seek simply the larger share and nothing else, but rather the most pleasant, so he seeks to enjoy not the longest period of time, but the most pleasant. Sometimes I feel like we ought to just repeat that every day, because I'm not so sure that that really sinks in. And this whole issue of time is so complicated. But I think that's basically what you were just saying, Joshua, is the attitude towards death and the attitude towards life. You don't want to feel like you're missing something after you're gone. So in order not to fear that you're missing something, you have to sort of come to terms with, well, what is it exactly that you're missing? And are you missing anything? Are you missing anything new? Are you missing anything significantly different? Or are you basically mentioning what we might call variation or seasoning? I think I've seen some people discuss it as well.
Yeah, we could probably talk for a little bit about this desire, which seems paradoxical, to escape life as it relates to the fear of death. It's hard to see what he's writing in response to here. And of course, this is a very difficult subject to talk about. And what we always say on the forum is, if you're having mental health problems, don't go to a philosopher, go to a therapist, go to someone who specializes in this kind of medicine. And in fact, stop listening to the podcast and go there now. But there's this idea, was it Seneca who said this quote? I can't think of how it goes. It's something like, here's how it goes. He says, the path to freedom is always before you. If you don't believe me, just turn over your wrist. I hope I'm attributing it correctly, but it's something that Epicurus is not going to advise in any situation. In fact, he says that when you recognize that there's nothing terrible in death, it makes you realize that there's nothing very terrible in life either. That's probably a very controversial thing to say, but so I guess the main thrust of this is that, it's something that we've been talking about a lot on the forum, is that you don't get an eternity. But if you did, it would be nice. It's not that life is meaningless, or that we have no desire to go on living, or that we should bow out when the time is right, or anything like that. It's, if we had more time, that would be great. But there will come a time in all of our lives when we will die. And if you don't think now about how you're going to approach that when it comes, you're probably going to be in a sorry state when it does come, and you're probably even more so going to be experiencing a kind of niggling fear in anticipation of it coming.
Well, I would say that there's two different things happening for how to approach this. People who feel secure and healthy, and life seems like it's flowing along really well. There's no sense of death on the horizon. That approaching this is very different than someone who is laying in bed with a terminal illness and who knows, they only have 6 months or 3 months left to live. I remembered that I once watched a movie called Wit, and that was about I think it was the year 2001, so quite an old movie. I'll read the description. Professor Vivian Baring, played by Emma Thompson, an expert on the work of 17th century British poet John Donne, has spent her adult life contemplating religion and death as literary motifs. Diagnosed with advanced ovarian cancer, she consents to an aggressive and experimental form of chemotherapy. So the whole movie is about her dealing with, she's facing death, and she is reflecting on her life and her work and trying to make sense of her mortality. So it's quite a heavy movie, but in some sense, it kind of takes you through all the steps required of considering your own mortality.
Of course, I haven't seen this movie, but the way you describe it, it sounds very interesting. Does the main character in this movie, does she find it difficult to reconcile her actual lived experience with the pain and the fear of death that comes along with cancer, with the more academic approach that she had taken throughout her life? Does she have a moment where she suddenly realizes that maybe she's not as well equipped to deal with this
Right.
as she thought she was? Is that the idea?
Right, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a challenge as well. When you say that death is nothing, it sounds so simple, but really there's very little that's simple about death. And I think that this idea of becoming accustomed to the belief that death is nothing, Cassius used the word flippant earlier, and I know he didn't really mean that, but it does mean that you're not going to solve this problem today, But as you continue to think about it and you continue to allow your response to what Epicurus is saying here to sort of to mellow or ripen in your mind, and then as you go through life, you'll be able to test that against different things that you experience in life. And then as you come to the end, I think you'll be able to approach that time in your life with the knowledge that this is something that you've been preparing for all the while.
Yeah, right, Joshua. When I referenced some people thinking it sounds flippant, I certainly did not mean to say that. I think it's flippant. In fact, when I say right, when I say it sounds flippant sometimes, I think that's a test. I don't think Epicurus is going to be ever flippant about anything. So if it sounds flippant, to me, that's an indication that we don't understand yet exactly what he's saying, because this is all so deep that if it comes across in a way that makes no sense, then, we can decide whether, well, is it you, the listener, who doesn't understand Epicurus, or is Epicurus just stupid? And generally, I take the position that Epicurus is not stupid. So if something sounds discordant, then there's something else to explore through it. And of course, what you're saying also, what both of you were saying, reminds me of I think it's the Vatican saying about every man approaches death as if he had just been born, or something like that. There's ultimately ways to take the sting out of it, but in the end, it's something we all have to live with, have to die with, that we don't live forever. So why don't we begin to close for today on that note? There is a lot of additional material here that probably what we've done today is just sort of introduce the topic of why it's important and so significant. And we'll come back next week and try to bring it to a conclusion and try to once again put it in perspective. Because again, it's, as Cassini's raised in the example of somebody who spends their whole life thinking about death, you have to wonder if Epicurus would say that that was a good use of her time. While you're supposed to think about it and put it in context, it seems to me a lot of this issue is intended to not only deal with the pain of dealing with it, but also to help motivate you to spend your time wisely while you're still alive. So there's many different perspectives that come from it, and probably, in fact, a whole episode could be devoted to this issue about, just as with food, he does not seek simply the larger share and nothing else, but rather the most pleasant, so he seeks to enjoy not the longest period of time, but the most pleasant. And I think that's one that just has so much implication to it on the issue of life and death and so many other things about what we discuss in Epicurus that it'll be worth spending another week on what we've read today. So in the interest of time, why don't we start with our closing statements for today, and then we'll come back next week. So Martin, closing thoughts for today.
I have not today.
Okay. Cassini, closing thoughts for today.
So I just remembered something. There's this movement where they call it a death cafe, and people get together to discuss death because it's something that, we kind of sweep it under the carpet. It's not part of regular conversation. There's almost a taboo about talking about death. And I've never been to one myself. I was very close to going, but people just get together and there's usually snacks, tea or cookies or something, and just talking about death and helping each other feel comfortable with that. I don't even know if that was just sort of a fad a few years back, how far that was going on. I know it was happening in Oregon. I don't know if they had it in like California, so maybe a West Coast thing. I don't know if they have it on the East Coast. But I just remembered how there are people contemplating what death means and trying to make sense of it. And so it's an important part of life, and maybe it's something to revive or look into for anyone who's interested in thinking more and also talking with other people.
That's very interesting. And you mentioned something that has been recognized and maybe goes under the name of the hidden death. And if you're curious, you can read more about that online. I think that's what it what it's generally called. But it's the idea that we don't have this face-to-face moment with death that people would have had in past times. People no longer die in the home very often. There's this whole professional, medical and administrative and funereal apparatus built up around death to, in a way, sort of keep it out of view. And the question that's being asked is whether that's something that's good for people or not.
And then when you do want to talk about it, you can hardly talk about it at all because it immediately becomes a conflict with religion, because the point that Epicurus was making is just directly contrary to any mainstream Western religion that we've grown up with anyway.
Cassius, you were barreling toward my closing comment there.
Go right ahead.
Yeah. What I wanted to get in here at the very end was, I think that there are people who, when they hear this, are going to just want Epicurus to shut up and think, that, okay, you're taking away sort of what Cicero was describing, the pleasurable feeling that I get, my only respite, my last sort of hope in this world is that there's something beyond the grave, and you just want to take that away from me. And all I wanted to articulate was the idea that simply to have an opinion about what happens when you die cannot be construed as being in any way a challenge to your individual equanimity. Certainly it's a challenge to the things that you believe, but we're not out here trying to just make people miserable. That's not the goal. In fact, it's the opposite of the goal. And one further point would be that if you hold the view, and probably not very common among anyone who's going to listen to this podcast, but if you hold the view that non-religious people, Epicureans, the nuns, as they're now called, if you hold the view that these people just ruin it for everybody by casting doubt on well-established ideas, I would put it to you, as Lucian put it to his readers in Alexander the Oracle Monger, that the real people that we should be taking issue with are not the people who are skeptical of claims being made by religion, but the people who have put forward these ideas, probably knowing themselves that these ideas were false. That's where you should direct your contempt. It's not toward Epicurus that you should be directing your energy. Certainly people throughout history have really, really hated Epicurus for things he had to say about life and death. That's fine. I'm not going to convince you not to do that. I doubt if I could. But just keep in mind the people who convinced you to believe what you believe, and ask yourself, if it turns out that you're wrong, is it Epicurus the one to blame, or is it Alexander the Oracle Monger, or people like him, these televangelists and these people who are just preying on fear and anxiety surrounding these very important issues? Do I have you wound up yet, Cassius?
You do, but I think I'm going to save most of my winding for next week. I'm looking at Lucretius line 80. But in these things I fear you will suspect you are learning impious rudiments of reason and entering into a road of wickedness. But so far from this, reflect what sad evil deeds religion has produced. And then there's that line, such scenes of villainy religion could inspire. There's more famous renderings
so
of it.
potent was religion in persuading to evil deeds.
Right. If you think that it's Epicurus who's calling you to tread on unholy ground, look around you and think about who is really the source of the evils that we run into in life, and you'll come up with a different picture.
I guess I would give the advice that after thinking about death, after talking about death, it's important to reaffirm the goodness of life and to realize that we have so many opportunities for pleasure and joy, and it's up to us to get creative with coming up with fun things, coming up with good things, happy things, and focus on the creative energy and creative power that we have over our own selves and over our lives, and how we can share that with people around us and build friendships. Join the Epicurean Friends Forum and make new friends.
I don't know that I have anything else to add today, so we may be ready to stop on Vatican saying 38. He is a little man in all respects who has many good reasons for quitting life. So it's very clear in Epicurean philosophy. For an eternity in the past, you've not been existing. For an eternity in the future, you will not exist. All you have is the time of your life to make the best of it. And so, yes, If you run up into circumstances, as Calasini was talking about earlier, all the different hazards of life that cause you to want to despair and feel like there's no way out, those things do happen. And in certain instances, Epicurus says that you can exit the play when it ceases to please us. Or the analogy that you raised, Joshua, from Seneca about turning over your wrist, or many other examples of things like that. Yes, the man who does not fear death can really fear nothing terrible in life because he knows there is an exit. But that is not the way to look first. It is a last resort, because once you've done that deed, there is no further existence whatsoever. There will never be any additional pleasure for you, no matter how many eons of time go by. So Vatican saying 38, he's a very little man in all respects who has many good reasons for quitting life. And as we'll come back and discuss next week as we continue in this section on life and death, how Epicurus says the same thing in his letter to Menoeceus about how bad it is to wish you had never been born. That is not the Epicurean position. You should not wish you'd never been born, because then you would have no opportunity to experience any pleasure whatsoever. So it's a complicated subject, but Epicurus' position, we talk about the analogy of glasses that are half full versus that are half empty. I'm convinced Epicurus, if he had to choose one of the two, he'd choose the half full one. As an attitude towards life, there are positive attitudes towards life and there's negative attitudes towards life. I think all of us would agree that Epicurus has a positive attitude towards life. Okay, with that, we'll close for the day and we'll come back in another week. So thank you, everybody, for your time today.
Seize the day. Bye.
Okay, bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.